Our examination of the question of slavery in the Old Testament will begin with some basics. As I stated in the outline in Part 2, what is described in much of the Old Testament is what we call indentured servitude, not slavery. In order to demonstrate this, we'll start by looking at some of the critical claims for why what we actually see is slavery. We'll begin by asking whether there are any passages which describe people as property. We'll remember that this was one of the two factors claimed to prove that the Old Testament prescribes slavery. But on what basis is it claimed that people are described as property in the Old Testament? I found that much of the arguing revolves around the use of these English words in the text. We'll leave the last two for our next vid. For right now, let's have a look at that first word by itself. The key word sometimes rendered slave reflects this Hebrew word. It appears some 800 times in the Old Testament. If a survey of translations means anything, as it often does to fundy atheists, the use of this word could reflect a point of discussion. Some, like the New International Version, render it as slave. Others, like the New American Standard Version, prefer the less offensive reading servant. Based on this, some might argue that versions like the New American Standard are trying to cover up that the Bible promotes slavery, but the reality is a little more complicated. A survey of the use of that Hebrew word indicates that while its semantic range would include such persons we'd call slaves, there is nothing about it that specifically distinguishes it as having that exclusive meaning. The word is used of kings like David to describe their relationship to Yahweh, and of prophets like Moses. It's also used of David as a vassal and mercenary of the Philistines. The Hebrew word clearly indicates some sort of subservient relationship, but the exact nature of that relationship must be established by context. And unfortunately for critics, the vast majority of uses of this word are devoid of any defining context. Take the example of Genesis 16, in which Hagar served as a handmaiden for Sarah, conceiving children for Abraham. Was Hagar considered property? Was she in the servitude relationship against her will? The text doesn't give any indication of either one, and the same may be said of the bulk of passages highlighted by critics. So in the end, are there any passages where a person is described with this word and they're regarded as property that can be bought and sold and is restrained against their will without lawful authority? In my survey of responding literature, I didn't find a single example of anyone so much as trying to argue this, except in one particular way. That's when they found the Hebrew word we've been discussing here, paired with one of the words from this duo. So that means that's where we'll have to turn next time.